Okay, so I think it's time for us to start with this final session today. So I think it's already dark outside. We are already late. And this session is about China. So when geopolitics, this word is concerned, we cannot avoid talking about China. So China is one of the most often talked countries, but people know that the way that China is interacting with the international community is that the government has been directly involved. So that itself is a part of geopolitical conflicts. And this is not new. This has been for many years. But now we are here to talk about something emerging new things in terms of geopolitical fragmentation, because we have been seeing China is doing the similar thing in the past maybe 2 decades. When China invested, they invested in aligned countries. So what are the new things? Probably, if I can think about this, elevated geopolitical fragmentation, I would say there are something new, and that is the third-party countries are now, they have to maybe take a side before they make any investment trade decisions. But this is something new that we should think of. But today we are talking about what is the changing position in terms of China's outward foreign direct investment. So we have 3 speakers, including myself. We have Dr. Yang Knowledge, who is from King's College London. And we have Jeffrey. Jeffrey, actually, I cannot pronounce your last name, sorry. Jeffrey is actually working with me as a postdoc at the Center for Global Finance, SOIS, University of London. So we 3 will present a kind of academic-oriented papers today. So just to give you a little bit of flavor, after this very, very interactive, important session, policy session, and see how much we have in terms of the, from the academic perspective, what do we see about China's OFDI in this context? So I will just briefly introduce Yang. Yang is a reader in China and the global political economy at King's College London. And he has been working on foreign direct investment, outward foreign direct investment for a very long time, and published extensively on this topic. And also, Yang's research is connected to political economy. So Yang is going to talk about actually fragmentation, thinking about what we have been observing on this. And Jeffrey, as I said, that has been a PhD, was a PhD at SOIS, actually was under the supervision of Victor before Victor moved to Nairobi. And and now Jeffrey is doing a postdoc with me. We also have a PhD who is not in this room. So, so without further ado, so I think I'm going to start with the presentation since I'm chairing. So the format is each of us will present about 15 minutes, and that was the plan. And then we will have a small within group open discussion. And then we open the floor to the audience for Q&A. It depends on how we are going. It's all flexible. So for me, I'm going to start with my presentation. Yeah, so this is basically a work in progress with one of my former PhD students. And he's now assistant professor in Providence University, actually in Taiwan. Okay. So what we are talking about in this paper is actually after the first round of US-China trade war. So we focused on not trade export, we focused on fixed investment or corporate investment, because corporate investment is the core activity of non-financial firms. And we also observed that there are many articles who have documented the spillover effect. So even though the trade war took place between US and China, but we see a lot of other countries responded to this as well. So, and of course, in the context of ongoing geopolitical fragmentation in different areas now. So we hope we can draw some conclusions or implications that we can think further. So the research question we asked in this paper is, how has the US-China trade war changed the Chinese firms' investment behavior? And what are the channels that carry those impact? And whether or not Chinese firms have used outward OFDI to hedge. So I call this a real hedge because it's a real activity rather than financial. So we contributed, we read a lot from the literature, and we think we filled some gaps in the literature in the following 4 areas. First of all, when we discuss about the impact of trade war, we distinguish between exporting firms and importing firms. And we have not seen that many evidence how they respond differently. And we also, in terms of the channels, in the literature, there is very often one channel, which is uncertainty channel. So trade policy uncertainty, but we add demand channel and financial constraint channel, because firms are hurt by trade war. So we had some evidence on that as well. And then we also link investment inefficiency to this trade war. And that was motivated by the overcapacity problem. So the people heard a lot of complaints against China about the Chinese firms, say they are because they produced too much, so they basically they created the problem. So we linked this, and lastly, as I mentioned, whether or not there is a real hedging. And if you look at what we have here, actually I can look at here. So if we look at this, the blue bars represent the firms that were affected by the trade war. So we call that economically treated firms. And the orange bars, they are for firms that were not really affected that much. If you look at their investment and or investment or inefficiency, you can see the blue bars, they went down, obviously, after 2008 and 9, the first round of financial trade war. So this is something that we want to explain a little bit. I will skip those literature given the time, but we already have seen a lot of studies that examined the impact on the trade. Basically, the 2 big countries, the US and China, they cut their trade with each other both ways. However, they diverted to third countries. We call them the so-called connector countries. And that's the pattern. In terms of real activities, I can show that those activities are all mentioned in the literature, and they are all negatively affected apart from one, innovation. So some researchers, they say they provided evidence that under pressure, under trade war, higher tariffs, firms became more innovative, such as the Chinese firms who are in the AI industry. Okay, so but in general, they are not good for firms' real activity. And the next one is about OFDI, and this is new. This is more current. So there are some evidence, but they are more descriptive evidence. They say that there are some reallocation of FDI. And for example, those third connector countries actually are doing more trade with America, but in fact, they are more connected with China in terms of FDI. So that's basically the idea about this trend. For people who are interested, you can go to this is it. So the last bit about this is there is an issue about how to measure this uncertainty. And in the literature, there are some different measurements. For example, if you know the tariff data, you can directly match the tariff with the firms. If you know the, for example, cases, anti-dumping cases, you can just match. But if you do not know, you can still use a significant event, such as, the trade war and Ukraine war. And the last bit is about finance method. You can do an event study to construct the measure. So that's basically what we have seen. This is a little bit technical, but this is our fundamental thing for this paper. So what we care about is actually those, the term, sorry, it's not, I cannot use this one probably, trade times post. So this is a DID model. I'm not going to extend this model, but the idea is we focused on what we classify the firms into two groups, whether they are affected and compare them with firms that are not affected, and that is treated versus control. And then we use another dummy variable post to check the behavior, whether the behavior is different after the trade war. So that's basically the idea of using this model, but I do not want to extend this model. So we use this model, we collected the data from different sources, firm level data and OFDI data, also the tariff data from the official website, and also some other related stock market data. So in fact, we have a large sample of Chinese non-financial firms during the period of, I think it is, 2011 to 2023. So I'm going to skip this again, given the time, but I would say one thing, we used the event study method to construct the measure to check whether or not the firm is affected. So the idea is we use the announcement date of high tariffs from the US and also from the Chinese side. We looked at the stock market return. So if the stock market reacted to those announcements negatively, we define the firm is a firm that is affected. So we use this in our empirical analysis, and of course we also check the real tariff. So we use the tariff data to do as an alternative. So I'm going to skip this, but in summary, our treated firms are larger. They are, for example, this is export firm. If you see the state, and they are more state-connected firms, and they sometimes they are larger, they are stronger, they are profitable, but they sometimes they are state connected. So we do different types of empirical analysis. The first one is the impact of trade war on firm investment. I'm going to skip the process, how we did it, but this is the result. So we have 14 tables, but I did not put up any tables today for you. So Chinese exporting firms, they cut fixed investment in response to the trade war. And therefore, their overinvestment, investment efficiency actually has been cut, has been going down after the trade war, which is probably a good thing. But the importing firms, the firms that are affected by Chinese retaliatory tariffs, they actually increase the investment. So that's basically the first one. And the second empirical analysis is, yes. So the second one is about the channels. I said we checked the demand channel, the financial constraint channel, the uncertainty channel, and this is the summary of the results. So treated export equals 1, that's for exporting firms. And treated US equals 1 are also for exporting firms. So demand channel we define this as the firm actually experienced a positive change in sales during the whole period. So they have a very strong demand. And liquidity is something that they have more cash and cash equivalent, etc. So they are strong in terms of their liquidity position. Uncertainty is the stock market volatility. If you see this table, the negative signs happens just for the firms that have suffered from the loss of demand. They suffered from a lower liquidity. They are facing more financial constraints, and they are facing high uncertainty. So that's basically the idea of these channels. So 3 channels take effect. They are all valid, but the impact on exporting firms is more profound. And the last bit is about the real hedging. For real hedging, at the moment, we used another model because we only have OFDI as an indicator, dummy variable, but we are working on that to collect more OFDI data from another source to match firms. But what we found is that both exporting and importing firms, they go outside, they increase their outward foreign direct investment. So that's basically the idea for both groups of firms. And the last bit is only one table. So in terms of policy implications, so I think this is something that we did not talk about export. We focused on investment, domestic investment, because this is something that is connected with other firms in emerging markets and developing economies, because they are still exporting to them. So, and the result on the different responses between exporting and importing firms are actually useful, because the policymakers should design any policy that consider the differences of those different firms rather than one policy. And yeah, in terms of OFDI, we are still doing more, but at the moment, our result is consistent with the ongoing literature. So there is a sign of reallocation, and particularly this is for Chinese manufacturing firms, and that will raise more questions about what happens in the next few years. So what policy makers should do in terms of considering the relocation, the impact of the relocation, the lack of more OFDI, lack of capital, and then what are the impact on the real activities. So I think that's mine. So we finish all the presentation and then we open the discussion. So this is, yeah, okay. Thank you.
Okay, this is working. I need the. Thank you. Okay, so first of all, thank you, Hong, for the kind invitation to this conference. I've followed the other two sessions, and I've already learned a lot and taken careful notes. Now it's my turn, and I hope I can deliver something as equally interesting. So I'm going to offer a think piece, I think, also a developing think piece, so it's not finalized or anything. Trying to address the theme of the conference: how does outward foreign direct investment from China, what does it have to do with fragmentation? And I'm not going to be comprehensive, so maybe you have further points. Yeah, it's taken from different strands of my research plus further thoughts. Okay. I will focus on FDI. That's very important. I'm not going to discuss loans. I'm not going to discuss project finance, very different type of financing. And I think my main point will be that it's a double-sided issue. Chinese outward FDI has contributed to fueling fragmentation. It's not the only thing, but it has played a role. And it is affected by fragmentation. So it's a two-part presentation. First, I will start with the fueling of fragmentation. And why has it fueled fragmentation? Because before China came along, Chinese firms, we had largely Western advanced economies doing the global FDI. And suddenly you have this new player who, with vast increases in FDI over 20 years, very quickly, globally operating from a system that is, we call often state capitalist, meaning many of the firms are state-owned or they are state-backed. Not like the firms that come from Britain, for example. So they're different. They want to acquire know-how overseas. They can do things overseas that firms from overseas cannot do in China, so it's not fair. There's lack of reciprocity. China growing as a strategic competitor and being authoritarian. So very different from former players in former multinationals that have been operating previously before China came around, right? So these are unique characteristics from a strategic competitor. As a result, I think we've seen a trend of politicization or even securitization of Chinese FDI, in particular in the developed world, but also somewhat in the developing world. And so what I have done in prior work is I have developed five types of politicization. I'll just mention them quickly. One is the structural power. And I think the point here is these could be all things where China can have a political or security role. But there are also arguments on each of these points why it doesn't really play a huge role politically, okay, Chinese firms. Okay, so structural power meaning the power of all multinationals from one country collectively able to influence the global order, international economic order. Well, I think the only group of firms you can really attribute that to is US multinationals. They have played a role in formulating the current rules-based system. But China is not there yet, yeah? Influence and leverage, maybe Chinese firms, if you have many Chinese firms in one country, they can exert influence and leverage. Greece is often brought up as an example. They buy a port, so Greece votes certain things in the European Union. But again, you know, try to find many examples. I don't find many. Third one is China invests overseas to get technologies and bring them back to China and help China catch up or move ahead. Yes, that probably has happened, but there are significant limitations. Western counterparts have prevented China from doing this as well. The fourth one is this idea of malicious activities, the latest one being electric buses in Denmark and Norway. That's the news from yesterday morning, that they're looking into Chinese-made electric buses, and that you could switch them off midway. So these kinds of things. Again, possible, has never happened, right? So, you know, how likely might it be? And the fifth one is China expands its soft power through outward FDI, maybe, but it's also an avenue for foreigners to exert soft power in China. So it's a two-way street, I would say. So the point I'm here making, yes, there's a politicization of FDI. It has happened. They're thinking of, you know, China using FDI for political ends, economic statecraft has been going around. But I think there's mixed evidence of this, personally. But it doesn't really matter whether it's actually happening or not, because the final point is, well, people have perceived this to be the case here in the UK and in Western advanced economies, and they have been suspicious, and that is what mattered for the process of fragmentation to take hold, right? Doesn't matter what actually happens, but what people believe might be happening. Okay? And it's not just an advanced economy thing. So just as one example, for example, when China tried to build or wanted to build a space monitoring station in Argentina, about 10 years ago, there were fierce debates in the parliament about building it, because obviously it has security implications, can be used for espionage and so on. But what happened is what happens usually with these things, they go through, at least until recently, and that happened there as well. But these are concerns several countries hold about Chinese investments. And I think, and this is an important point from my point of view, on top of this, you know, what fueled this further is this lack of differentiation between project finance and OFDI stock, right? So at the top right, at the right, you have project finance, and you see a lot of project finance loans go to developing countries from China. But on the left, you see OFDI, and you see a lot of OFDI goes to developed economies, right? And the OFDI is not as politicized. These are multinational enterprises actually putting their own money in to make an investment. Often it's manufacturing things, you know, building things. Whereas on the other side, as a government, the loans are governments making investments. And these are obviously political, because it's the government making the investment or providing the loan. So the colleague here, who unfortunately is not well, is an expert on this. So Linda, I would normally leave it to her to discuss this further. But it's an interesting phenomenon. Chinese investments is, you know, you have to separate between at least these two to understand the political dimension of Chinese investments. All right. So somehow Chinese FDI, Chinese investments have fueled fragmentation, right? So they have our suspicions. So what is the impact of this then? And so the second half of my presentation is, you know, how is China now experiencing this fragmentation? How are Chinese companies doing FDI experiencing this fragmentation? And I have these 5 points, and these are really work in progress for broadly developed for this meeting, in fact. So, these are 5 types, and I think the interesting thing about it, we see them sort of intensifying, but these are things that Chinese firms, many of these things, Chinese firms have been doing them for quite a long time, in fact. So let me come to that in further detail. So first of all, what happened because of perceived or real concerns about political dimension of Chinese FDI is that many countries started restricting or imposing restrictions on Chinese investments. So that started in 2016, when there was a pretty large amount of Chinese investments going out. And you can see that from 2020 onwards, 2019, lots of countries came in to actually strengthen investment screening or in putting it in place. So they could screen an investment that they think jeopardizes Chinese national security. So even the UK came in with one. It didn't have a system before. Now it has one since 2021. It applies to all investors from everywhere, but clearly the agenda was for many governments that China was, and Chinese firms were coming along, and all these uncertainties were attached to them. Okay, and this is also not limited to advanced economies. Many emerging markets and developing economies have introduced investment screening, but not as tough as not as tough yet as advanced economies. I think the interesting point about this is that they were all put in place, but most investments will still go ahead. So very few investments actually get blocked. The statistics say that. So most of the time investments go ahead, but for China, it had a chilling effect. China basically, many Chinese firms were subsequently decided it may not be better to pursue investments in certain locations, and FDI from China went down in many countries. The second is reassurance. So what China has done for a long time, actually, and is probably intensifying, it's reassuring global audiences that investments are benign and that these concerns are not legitimate. Right, and there are various strategies here. You see a move to greenfield investments, right? So the concern is often with Chinese firms buying European firms, for example. So they start introducing greenfield FDI. And this greenfield FDI goes elsewhere. That may be interesting for some economies, right? It doesn't go here, but it often goes in Europe, it goes to Hungary. So it could go elsewhere, right? To developing or emerging markets potentially. And greenfield is, they have to build a factory by themselves, so it's much more desired type of investment, much less controversial. So they do that now much more often. There are more private firms investing, as you can see in that graph. And what you find them doing is, they try to localize, so become local firms and engage with local communities. The Chinese government is promoting good citizenship and corporate social responsibility more than in China. It's trying to make its state-owned firms really have good corporate social responsibility records and good citizenship records when they're overseas. There's codes of conduct for that. They do things like light touch, so they buy firms. When they buy firms, they've always done that. They actually don't integrate them, but they just leave them in foreign hands and management. And you have other things like here in the UK, you have the cybersecurity evaluations. So the idea is a grant agency, right? In Africa, actually, there's a lot of talk about granting agencies to Chinese firms, to Chinese firms or China granting agencies to African entities, African governments to sort of say, we come, but you tell us how you want to engage with us, right? So that's also happening. That's seeing the acquisitions going up and down again in 2016. Diversification, that also happened before. That's not new because China has a labor cost problem. Labor costs are going up, so they have to diversify out of China. But what's happening now is that, as I said, they're diversifying out of Western Europe, out of the United States because of screening, the cooling investment environment. They're diversifying out of China, not only because of labor costs, because of trade barriers. So they go to places like, I think the big places are really Vietnam, Mexico, and then they export from there to Europe or to the United States. So here there are changes happening as a result of the fragmentation. Yeah, so here's a list of some of the key beneficiaries at the end. Let's see. Concealing, I sort of mentioned this already. Concealing that you're a Chinese investor. Also have been doing that for all the time, but I think probably becoming somewhat more normal. Telling everyone that you're a local firm, you're not a Chinese firm, or you're really detached from being a Chinese firm. And I think this one is a good one. So goodwill is, it says at the end, it's a Ugandan firm, or it's a Chinese firm in Uganda, right? You can say made in Kapika, where the Liaoshan Industrial Park, Chinese Industrial Park, in fact, is located, but made in Kapika to build Uganda, right? So they're very Ugandan-oriented framing there. And so that's also a strategy that they often apply. And the fifth one is strategic edge. I felt the need to add that. Of course, due to geopolitical fragmentation, for China, but that's been there before as well, but for China, it's becoming also more and more important really to get hold of the key resources for future, that matter to future technological development. Where they have rare earths in China, but they are actually going overseas as well to acquire all kinds of mines for nickel, cobalt, lithium, things that you can use in batteries and so on. And it seems to me, as I understand it, they have a head start there. They're ahead of the West. And so that's also happening and intensifying as a result of global fragmentation, geopolitical fragmentation. So quickly, I think, opportunities and challenges. I actually got a longer list of opportunities in the end. But, you know, FDI remains an opportunity. I think even Chinese FDI, you know, it creates employment, many other things. Participation in China-linked supply chains, since China has to leave, Chinese firms have to leave China, so it's interesting to get these firms, so not only Vietnam gets them. Obviously could attract Chinese mining investment, certainly issues around how to do that best, but it's a potential opportunity. And I think always a theme benefiting from both Chinese and Western engagements. So from an emerging economy point of view, that's always been a theme. We can have both. We're trying to have both. And also expansion of South-South investments. So when China cannot do something anymore because of geopolitical fragmentations, maybe Indian firms in the future, for example, can come in and do this, what China's not doing anymore. Challenges, I think, are more generic. It's an uncertain environment that's not good for business. It's probably going to harm developing and emerging economies as well. Having to choose sides between, or being forced to choose sides between China and the US or the West on these issues, that certainly creates uncertainties and probably will not be beneficial for developing countries. Yeah, I think that's fragmentation of global standards. If China has some standards and the West have other standards and they can't agree on them anymore, then maybe the spillover effects from FDI will be reduced because you have different types of standards and that will make things more complicated to learn from a developing country point of view. So these are the sort of the points. Happy to take in more for the development of this work. And I'm happy to pass on to the next presentation.
Hello, good afternoon. Okay. This is a joint work with Professor Bo and Professor Murinde. So in this work, we look at the effect of the host nation's sovereign risk on China's overseas infrastructure investment. So, and we specifically cover 2013 to 2023 period. Okay, so to begin, I want to have a quick look at China's investment in infrastructure projects across 110 countries that we cover in this study since 2013 when the Belt and Road Initiative started. So we present this graph alongside the key components of sovereign risk, which are public debt levels and sovereign credit ratings. So we expect rising sovereign debt level to be associated with declining sovereign ratings and lower levels of China's overseas infrastructure investment. So when you look at the two graphs at the top of the screen, you can clearly see that sovereign credit ratings has clearly declined in graph 2, in line with the rising public debt levels in graph 1, which is consistent with our expectations. But when you look at the graphs below, that's graph 3, that's for the OII, the overseas infrastructure investment, we have two patterns between 2013 and 2019. OII barely responded to the rising sovereign risk level. Then we observed this sharp decline in 2020. So these observations is telling us that China's overseas infrastructure investment may not follow the traditional higher risk, lower investment patterns. And that raises one question for us: how come sovereign risk is now more important to China, even though it didn't seem to matter between 2013 and 2019? So a possible explanation is that COVID-19 as a common shock has intensified the negative effect of sovereign risk. So that's what we have investigated in this study. So we make the connection between the host country's sovereign risk and investment levels through the debt overhang theory. In essence, rising public debt levels increase sovereign risk, and higher sovereign risk discourages foreign investors. This is a mechanism that is well documented in the credit risk literature, where it clearly explains how rising public debt levels can become problematic. It suggests that the large risk premiums associated with high debt levels can impose significant cost on the economy, reducing capital formation and economic growth. So these vulnerabilities makes future fiscal policy highly unpredictable and a major source of concerns for investors, because the more these countries borrow, the higher interest they have to pay, and the longer the negative effect of sovereign risk can persist. So as a result, there is lower incentive to invest in high sovereign risk countries. But applying this to China is a little bit interesting because, as we know, China has invested heavily in many developing countries, including vulnerable ones, since 2013. So what we did in this study, we looked at how global shock can change the effect of sovereign risk. So that is what we have basically investigated in this study. Let me put it forward. So we have several recent studies which shows that global shocks such as COVID-19 or the 2008 financial crisis have large and long-lasting effects on the economy, whereas the effect of country-specific shocks are small and short-lived. This is why investment levels tend to decline during global shocks, especially in high sovereign risk nations where investors demand significantly higher returns to compensate for the risk. Something that we also have to remember is that when COVID-19 started, a lot of countries were already carrying heavy debt levels. By the end of 2020, some of these countries had already defaulted, and their sovereign ratings had also dropped. So that compromised their fiscal credibility and ability to access funds during COVID-19. So why countries with deep markets were able to access funds to invest in health and economic recovery programs, high sovereign risk nations were forced to adopt fiscal austerity during COVID-19 when public investment was most needed. So what we take from all of this is that pre-existing sovereign risk shaped nations' capacity to respond to COVID-19, attract investment, and rebuild the economy. It also shows that shocks like COVID-19 do not create vulnerabilities. They expose them. Global public debt level and interest payments were already at record levels in 2019. So COVID-19 created the perfect conditions for this risk to materialize. Okay, so when we put together the overview of this literature, then which suggests a negative relationship between sovereign risk and investment levels, and the fact that that relationship can be intensified by global shocks. So we start our empirical investigation by looking at how the interaction between sovereign risk and COVID-19 influenced China's overseas infrastructure investment. So because the level of reduction we've seen since COVID-19, it could be that is due to the significant reduction in countries with high sovereign risk due to slower recovery in these countries. So specifically, we investigate whether high sovereign risk nations have received significantly lower investment from China than lower sovereign risk nations. So even when we finish that, I don't think that answers all our questions because China is still investing. You know, there are investment going into a few other countries. So we wanted to look at mitigating factors. So one of those factors is natural resources, which is has always been consistently positive in this literature. So because we know from the literature that a positive relationship exists between natural resources and natural resources to China and OII investment in the host country. So we investigate whether the negative relationship between sovereign risk and OII, as the infrastructure investment, is weaker in resource-rich countries. So we also consider another factor, which is geopolitical alignment. We live in geopolitically tense moment, and we know that geopolitically aligned countries trade more with each other because it helps to reduce risk. So we also check whether this negative relationship of sovereign risk is weaker in geopolitically aligned host nations. Okay, for our empirical investigation, this is our dependent variable, the China's overseas infrastructure investment. We obtained the data from China Global Investment Tracker for 110 countries. And the period covered is 2013 to 2023. This is how we construct our independent variable. We use the sovereign credit ratings. So we take the average of the top three rating agencies, the S&P, Fitch, and Moody's. So we assign scores to each of these scores from AAA to D. So the highest score of 20 is for AAA, and the lowest score of 0 is for D. Then we take the average of the three for each country. Okay, this is, we employ a very standard DID model where our dependent variable is the log of China's overseas infrastructure investment. Then for the treated, we assign one to countries that with average sovereign credit ratings in the lowest 25%, because in this distribution, the lower the ratings, the higher the sovereign risk. So those in the lowest 25% is our treated countries. Then the post is the period between 2020 and 2023. We include some control variables, the host country's natural resources range, institutional quality, infrastructure. Then we separate trade openness to China from trade openness to the rest of the world because we wanted to capture the different effects and GDP growth rate. We also include time and host countries' regional fixed effect in the model. Okay, this is the first set of results. The results in column 1 is for the total OII, which is the China's overseas infrastructure investment. The variable that we are interested in is the top one, which is post-treated. So that tells us whether countries that have high sovereign risk have received lower infrastructure investment from China. And the coefficient of that is negative and is significant, which confirms our argument. Then the next two columns, we estimate for intensive and extensive margins. So the intensive margins is basically the size of investment. Then the extensive margin is the number of investment. So both results are also negative and significant, suggesting that the reduction we've seen in column 1 applies to both the size and number of new investments. Then for the key control variables, I'm not sure I have the time to go through all of them, but they are vulnerable variables. Okay. Okay, then for the mitigating factors, what we've done here is the resource-rich countries and non-resource-rich countries. Then we have countries that are geopolitically aligned with China and those that are not. So our resource-rich countries are those that derive at least 50% of their exports from natural resources. And as we can see in column 1 and 2, resource-rich country, the negative effect of sovereign risk is not significant. In other words, the post-treated coefficient is not significant in column 1. But when you look at column 2, you see that the one that I highlight up there, you see that is significant. So which suggests that in non-resource-rich country, the negative effects holds. The same analysis applied to geopolitically aligned and non-aligned countries. We can see that the aligned countries, the negative effect of sovereign risk is also not significant. But for non-aligned countries, that result is also significant. So for our measure of geopolitical alignment is based on how countries vote in the UN National Assembly. So in other words, that political proximity. So our aligned countries here are those in the top quarter of that distribution. So they are more closer to China in terms of their geopolitical affinity. Okay, this is a quick summary of the research. We find that high sovereign risk nations have received significantly lower infrastructure investment from China since COVID-19. And that effects apply to both size and number of new investments. Natural resources and geopolitical alignment mitigate that effect. So in terms of policy implications, we know that, well, it's good to have to use natural resources to attract investment from China, but we advise that that has to be done with caution, because focusing on natural resources means other key sectors in the economy can be abandoned. And it also for policymakers to keep eye on their credit sovereign ratings or sovereign risk. And lastly, this sort of investment can bring a nation into geopolitical alignment, even if they were not there before, because the more this investment increase, then the more countries become aligned, and they have to understand that brings some negativity or vulnerability, especially smaller nations. Thank you.
Talked about, and so I probably will start with Yang. So we have actually we had a cancellation last night, so we should have one more, but let's do this very quickly. So Yang, I can see that you have been thinking quite a lot about the past pattern that we observed in terms of Chinese OFDI, and in this the context of today's conference. So I would like to ask you, what do you think about the role played by economic blocs? Let's say economic or geopolitical blocs, such as BRICS, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, maybe GCC as well, and ASEAN. Do you think, in the context of this new level of geopolitical fragmentation, which area is going to be affected? And I forgot Africa. So Africa as well. So which area, but Africa is, is not, but which area do you think will be affected the most or will benefit the most either way?
Okay. I found it interesting in the talk in the very beginning by Colin, right? Made the point. I mean, it was really much focused on sort of the my country first point of view, right? And the geopolitical fragmentation of that. And I agree that's one very important political development that we see in particular also in Europe and the United States. If you ask me as someone, of course, studying China, for me, the fault lines, the main ones for geopolitical fragmentation is the US-China relationship and then slash EU-China, maybe sort of as a side note. But that's what fuels that's the main source of geopolitical fragmentation from my point of view, from my sort of professional background. And that's not going to go away. Well, primarily US-China, but the West, as we call it, against China, I think is a key source of fragmentation. And a lot of that will continue. Now, who can benefit, who can lose out? And that's probably where I agree more with what was probably said in the past. It'll be complex. So, for example, in Southeast Asia, it seems you have one country benefiting, Vietnam, right? Or, India seems to benefit somewhat, but it's complicated because that relationship is, again, with China is complex. And they also have some reservations about some Chinese investments and so on. So it's a complex, I think, a complex system. I think one group that might be quite benefiting from it is the Gulf Cooperation Council that you mentioned, because somehow they have found a new role now. They can do many things also on the not just economic side, but diplomatic side. They seem to me to come quite well out of the situation at the moment, but it remains complicated. Africa, I think, was mentioned as more inward looking. The opportunities more now what Africa can do in Africa, and I think that's very important. Whether it will become the next place for Chinese investments remains to be seen. I think some issues around having sufficiently attractive investment environments, Southeast Asia probably being having countries that have it easier to attract Chinese investment. So I think this is sort of to characterize it. I think Russia is not very important. They're staying away from Russia somewhat because it's not clear how the whole situation with Russia will play out in the future.
Also sanctions as well.
Yeah.
And, but further, have you finished?
Yes, I finished.
I have a more sensitive question. Do you think China is going to lose from the fragmentation battle?
Well, I think the problem for China,
reduce its investment in the next maybe a few years?
The problem for China is that it has in many ways benefited from the previous system. So I think it's not very happy, in fact, about the current system because it has benefited enormously from the previous system. I found also the interesting thing is that very little was talked about China, but China is a case of incredibly successful economic development. It's probably the most successful case of economic development. Not sure who is responsible, whether it's the international community as a whole, or whether it is China which did it on its own, but I actually don't think so. I think the environment, even the United States played an important role in supporting China to get to where it is now. So China is a huge beneficiary from the current system as it has been. And so I think it is personally not beneficial from China where it's heading, but it'll find its way. I mean, they're very flexible, they're very creative, innovative. So on technologies, being kept out of technologies could provide impetus for further innovation in China. So there could be benefits that we don't expect to happen happening anyway because China can deal with these challenges now.
Thank you. I think I understand what you as an original Chinese. So I do see there are lots of rooms that China can play around, and it is still uncertain who is going to lose this the whole investment fight. Jeffrey. So you were well done for your presentation, actually. And so in that paper, actually, we found a very interesting thing. China, after COVID-19, China started to be responsive to host country sovereign risk. And that's the key message that we are. So based on this, do you think, or let's say focusing on host countries, I mean, they do need investment. It doesn't matter who is investing, but they need to attract more investment. Now, if China is aligned with the market rule, the system that they respond to country level sovereign risk, how do the host countries, what do they do to attract sufficient or not sufficient, much needed investment?
Okay, from China, right?
No, for host countries.
Okay.
No, from
China.
from China or from in general.
Okay.
So host countries,
Yeah.
what do they do?
Okay, thank you. I think most of the time we always focus on the host country. Sometimes I think I don't want to sound political, but I think the problem is actually a bit beyond host country, because the way I say it, when you look at sovereign risk, you have to first of all ask, why are these countries always in debt? Why are they in this cycle? Look at it this way: they have a very they have narrow tax bases and very fragile revenue streams. Then they have these massive tax rates. So when you look at why those things are, you know that one, I'll highlight two things. First of all, why you have a lot of advanced countries able to have their loans in local currencies, these emerging and developing countries, they cannot. Their loans are always in foreign currency. That exposure cannot be removed from why they are where they are, because one, their currency is very non-stable, and inflation can hit anytime. So as soon as that happens, then their interest rate increase. Then the second point I would like to highlight is market perception. You know, when you look at how sovereign risk is measured, you have two key elements: the level, the volume of debt, which we just explored. Then you have the market perception about that country. And that one always works against emerging and developing countries. Look at what happened during COVID-19. You have America, Germany, and the rest. They were able to, Germany was borrowing at the rate of 1%, America 3%. But do you know their debt level is over 100 of their GDP? When you look at developing nations, they have like 50 or 60 something. Then you have to wonder, why is it like that? Because emerging and developing countries. Okay. All right. Emerging and developing countries are less likely to are more likely to default. And the reason they are more likely to default, they pay higher interest rate. And so the reason they pay higher interest rate is because of this market perception, even if they have small amount of loans, but the market perception. So for them, that is the external one. Then the internal one for the host nations, in terms of attracting more investment from China, just to add a little bit, I think that can come with finding a way to improve their bargaining position, which would be reducing their sovereign risk. And the best way they can do that is to try and find a way to make sure each project that is being financed is linked to a productive project, so that the revenue from that project can then finance the interest rate. So that improves their position. Yeah.
So so I think we only have a few minutes left, so probably we should open. But you see, you blame the actors rather than the host countries. That's the way of answer my questions. Always find a way.
Because the position they are is, this is a
That's
political.
okay. That's
very
okay.
political.
Yeah. I got you. I get it. So let's open the floor to the audience. So if you have any questions that are related to our three presentations, I would like to pick up maybe 2 or 3 questions. I saw first hand and second hand. So shall we go the first hand, please? So where, I do not know where is that, yeah.
This one, is that one working?
That's okay.
Can you hear me? Yeah, that's
Yeah.
better. My name is Alexis Torrell. I work for Development Unlocked. Thank you for the presentation. During your research on OFDI, China OFDI to host countries, did you investigate the issue about local content and local content legislation and regulations in host countries? And if you did, what were your findings in terms of, you know, the difficulty of aligning and complying with that those local content regulations vis-a-vis, you know, China needing to engage a local workforce and not necessarily bringing in their own workforce and their own supply chains, etc., and also had to do with obviously equity as well. So I'd be interested to understand if that was part of your research assignment. Thanks.
Is your question directed to me or for everybody? So Yang, maybe you. Yeah, shall we take a, yes, here, please. Yeah, thank you.
Hello, my name is Anand. I'm a student from SOAS. My question is for Jeffrey. I think the session was more about FDIs from China, but then I also want to link it to some of the points made by previous speakers. You said there are various political reasons why these countries are in high sovereign risk. Some of the previous speakers have spoken about domestic resource mobilization, especially pension funds. So why is there a way the pension fund can co-finance some of the Chinese FDI? If that is one of the solutions, and why that is not happening? Because there is a general recognition that there is long-term patient capital available in the form of pension funds, but they're not being invested in productive investment. So why do you think that is? Is that also a political reason why a lot of these countries are in high sovereign debt risk? Thank you.
Do we have another question? We just pick 3 in total. Yeah, yes, please. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, it's unfortunate your work didn't extend to Africa. I think you're more focused on Europe. I would have been more interested to know what your views are on Africa, especially recently. China is negotiating zero tariff with African countries. I mean, what are the implications of such an agreement? I think it's something that we need to know. And then to you, your infrastructure, I also find it very interesting. But I wish to know the gap, an infrastructure gap, and whether Chinese FDI, what proportion is it filling? I mean, what impact is it making? Perhaps it would be good to touch on that as well. Thank you.
And when you say gap, infrastructure gap, what do you mean by that? Across countries?
Yeah, across countries, across regions. If he has that data, it would be interesting to know.
Yeah, so can we answer who is Yang? Do you want to start? Can I just respond to the gap issue? So in another project, actually, we did check, we calculate the gap among actually host countries, between each pair. And then we do find that Chinese infrastructure investments, such as the one we see in Africa, is actually working effectively, more effectively for the country that is, the gap is larger. So, and that makes sense from economic theory. And so we can go back to the question. Yang, you can take over another one.
I can try all of them if it's okay.
Yeah.
I'll have a go. I mean, local content, it's interesting. I'm not too familiar what the rules are in Africa. One thing I just find interesting that China took a lot of advantage of local content, and I'm not sure if that's possible elsewhere. In particular, if China wasn't a member of many international institutions, inclusive of the WTO for a long time. And some say, well, that quite have benefited China, and it had more policy space to develop, right? That's just one thought on local content. But I think your point was about workforce, in fact, things like what China is doing. And what China is doing, as far as I understand, generalizing quite strongly, of course, is again this differentiation. So project finance, they are bringing in their own labor because their labor is the best in terms of building roads, railways, infrastructure. They're most efficient. They come in for projects, they build them, and they leave. But from FDI and manufacturing, that's why I differentiate the two. There's actually quite a lot of more local employment because because of labor laws, but also immigration laws, but also because of developmental goals and labor costs, right? Okay. So I think that's sort of a differentiation there. Pension funds is an interesting one. I'm not sure if Chinese pension funds are advanced enough or have the capacity. Okay, but Chinese pension funds funding their projects now, co-funding projects in Africa, that's the problem there. With other pension funds, it would mean arranging the collaboration with Chinese investors, which I could believe might involve difficulties. Or I mean, that's the sort of partnership thing that needs to be worked out. We talked a lot about, but I think that there may be constraints there that would need to be worked through. And on Africa and the zero tariff, yeah, it's an interesting one, right? Geopolitical fragmentation has not much to do with FDI, but geopolitical fragmentation. One country moves itself, imposes tariffs, China comes in and fills the gap. And I think we'll see that more and more often. And that's a perfect example of it. Creates opportunities for Africa to import and export to China and import from China. But it is also, it intensifies trade dependence on China. I mean, the problem nowadays with China really is, and that's why the current system cannot continue. The problem really with China is it's trading everything. Very soon it'll trade everything. Nobody else will be producing anything anymore if things go on. And I think there the challenges are everywhere, but these challenges exist in Africa as well, because Africa wants to manufacture its own stuff and not import everything from China. So these are the things that then have to be worked out.
So to add one sentence to each. So for localization, I'm going to finish first. So for localization, I think the next step for Chinese investment will be localized. So to utilize the existing stock. So we found we have some other works on this, but there is some evidence. For pension funds, I think it requires the local capital market development as well. So if even Western pension funds do not even buy for the green bond, for example, there is no developed secondary market. So how do we expect them to buy Chinese investment? So we need a market. And the last bit is African. So it's difficult to say whether or not Africa should now go outside to ask for money from other sources. So let's see what happens in the next a few years. But China has built up a lot of things in Africa. And that things, infrastructure investment is the fundamental. Maybe sometimes at this stage is more important than financing. So that's something that I think we should, I cannot really read any messages. So given the time, Jeffrey, shall we discuss maybe, off the stage here? So thank you very much for your patience. And I hope at least you got some insights. And we still, continue to perfect, to improve our work. So thank you very much. And thanks for your questions as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.